I feel a certain amount of kinship with James Rolfe. We're basically the same age. We both went to film school. We both ultimately found ourselves making videos about media for YouTube. Better known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, James has this behind-the-scenes video that I can't stop thinking about. AVGN Behind the Scenes and Nerd Room Tour 2021. There's just so much going on with it. There's a light stand suspended from the ceiling with craft wire, a cable hole made in a desk by attacking it with a drill like a slasher villain. The whole thing begins with an awkward disclaimer that the audio is being recorded from a different microphone just off screen than the one that's immediately apparent.
I recorded this entire video and realized this mic is not plugged in. The shotgun mic is plugged in.
Then there's the tripod. James expresses a desire to keep things out of his way, tripods, light stands, and such, to maximize floor space in his studio. A worthy goal I can empathize with as I sit here in a veritable forest of aluminum and steel. But then he shows his solution. A tripod head secured to a strip of lumber by two mismatched scraps of wood. It is a wrong thing, a kludged together precarious mess whose wrongness is intuitively apparent even to those who have little familiarity with the equipment of filmmaking. This thing ruined my life in the way that only the inexplicable decisions of strangers can. Why was this made? Why was this made this way? What was happening that created the circumstances that led to this being made the way that it was made? Many of the solutions being shown off in the video seemed counterproductive, solutions to inefficiency more inefficient than the original problem. This glimpse behind the scenes paints a blurry yet still identifiable picture of a process of endless maintenance, a forever war James Rolfe is engaged in against the twin belligerents of entropy and James Rolfe. He includes a captivating outtake from the recording of his 2021 video, Shrek Fairy Tale Freakdown, where he's tied to a chair and trying to hold an onion in his mouth like a ball gag. He loses his grip on the vegetable and lashes out in frustration, cursing the onion, cursing the ropes, cursing COVID, cursing the lack of hands to help.
Boy, I wish I had a crew. Wish we didn't have COVID and all this fucking bullshit.
It is a sincere frustration, honestly more compelling than the video it's from, but it betrays a lack of foresight, a lack of planning, and its inclusion feels rhetorically misplaced. This rhetorical confusion marbles throughout the studio tour. Repeated shoutouts given to his multi-channel network Screenwave, a seemingly out-of-left-field defense of his wife April, and a laundry list of one-off projects consuming his time. James says he'll be addressing some complaints, in his words,
of the asshole-ish variety,
which suggests that there's something more going on. But why say these things? Why make these admissions? I thought I knew the Angry Video Game Nerd. I distinctly remember huddling with my film school peers around a computer in 2006, laughing over Chronologically Confused and mentally noting that the inevitable had begun. Serving video over the internet was on the cusp of viability, and the web was already developing its own vernacular. Internet videos weren't just the happenstance of virality anymore, out of context clips forwarded via email or repurposed clips of shows and movies. They were things being made for the internet, and everything was about to change. I may not have been the most ardent fan, but it was impossible to not know about the Angry Video Game Nerd and, by extension, James Rolfe, the man behind the Pocket Protector. As the story goes, James Rolfe was a pioneer of new media. While he arguably spawned the entire genre of angry reviews and undeniably set the tempo for thousands of creators, he set himself apart from the crowd by being a trained filmmaker, having a leg up on the skill sets of lighting, sound, and camera work. Even as YouTuber became a real career, he never really seemed to embrace the identity, always seemed apart from it. As his peers would often detail, he wasn't a YouTuber, he was a filmmaker. But how could I square that reputation with this admission of his process, with the light stands arduously suspended with craft wire in lieu of a $15 scissor clamp? James says his camera work has grown stagnant, claims that it frustrates him most of all, before detailing an insistence on disassembling an entire rig to move from the prompter to the tripod, rather than using a quick release plate or investing in a second camera body, only to then, minutes later, admit to having a second camera body. This made me keenly aware of one thing above all. I do not know James Rolfe. Having glimpsed something of his oddities, the distant specter of the man gripped me with a hunger for comprehension, a compulsion to know more. Fortunately, he had already offered me more. In 2022, James self-published his memoirs and autobiography, A Movie-Making Nerd. Circumstances being what they are, I feel a reintroduction is necessary. Between 2004 and 2006, fresh film school grad James Rolfe created a trilogy of short skits where he played a stereotypical nerd, complaining about old Nintendo games. The character lampooned something that James saw as inherently funny: his friends getting intensely angry about video games. His university buddy, Mike Matai, thought they were hilarious, and in 2006 uploaded the videos to the fledgling YouTube, where they would see enormous success, compelling James to make more of them and creating what we now know as the Angry Video Game Nerd. The brand and format coalesced quickly and has remained largely unchanged for 20 years. For the 7th video, McKids, their friend Kyle Justin wrote an absolute earworm of a theme song that is honestly somewhere between 40 and 80% of the reason that we're having this conversation in the first place. It's gonna take you back to the past. For the first many years, the show was a collaboration between Mike and James. Mike, an avid retro gamer with an extensive collection, would feed James material and manage logistics like web hosting, maintaining the YouTube channel, securing partnerships with outlets like Screw Attack, and James would handle the video production. The show's comedy hinged, and really still hinges, on a combination of acidic vulgarity, casual violence, and an excess of juvenile machismo.
This game is worse than a Mischief Night prank. Mischief Night is throwing toilet paper all over someone's yard. This game is the equivalent of throwing toilet paper after you wiped your ass. It's as refreshing as a horse's anus. Fuck the crawl up its bird ass, and fuck you, you fucking clown-faced Joker, Kiss makeup wearing King Diamond, Beetlejuice, Alice Cooper, Marilyn Manson motherfucker!
But it wasn't James's first creation. James did not apparate ex nihilo in 2006, and A Movie Making Nerd is an opportunity to delve into that prehistory. Now is as good a time as any to mention the odd conflict that swirls around James. He has attracted a not insubstantial audience of cankerous hate watchers, self-styled truthers who have made a hobby of disseminating what they see to be the truth of James Rolfe, that he is a man of hubris, ungrateful for his success on YouTube, and dismissive of the very fans who gave him a career in the first place. Alternately, a know-nothing failure of a filmmaker, or a cuckolded visionary who could have had it all if he hadn't been laid low by his bitch wife. I am far from the first person to ask the question, who is James Rolfe? James is, by reputation, personally extremely offline. He values his privacy and sees social media as a distraction from his craft, tries to keep his personal life personal. That is an admirable quality, but it's also obviously not a hard line. Obviously, I'm holding a copy of his self-published autobiography. Whatever secrecy James enjoys by not dropping selfies on the gram every day, he makes up for with infrequent but overwhelming trips into his personal affairs. He may not go often, but when he goes big. And maybe that is why it has wormed its way into my brain. Not all of the fascination with the historical arc of the AVGN is odious. There is something profoundly compelling about James. People who become aware of his quirks find themselves enthralled.
Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. There's 10 more videos to make on this subject, but that's James Rolfe and the DVX 100.
People talk about James in a very specific way. My friends talk about James in a very specific way, and I have developed a very strange, almost adversarial relationship with that. The cultural impact of AVGN is undeniably far-reaching. He is, without question, the direct inspiration for many, many imitators and derivatives. AVGN set the tone that all YouTube reviews would in some form or another respond to. 2 decades on, the cultural impact of AVGN is deep in the DNA of YouTube. But it is also likewise easy to overstate the uniqueness of the angry video game nerd, as though James captured something that would have never otherwise existed. The concept of media critique as entertainment did not begin with James Rolfe. The bottom line is this: Swamp Buggy Racing is one of the most inexplicably bad pieces of software ever mass-produced for the consumer market. Do not buy it, do not rent it, do not even pick up the box. I'm going to go launch the game one last time to get screenshots for this review, and after that I'll be giving the game disc to the 4-year-old who lives downstairs so he can turn it into a colorful frisbee. 6%, PC Gamer, May 2000. Classic. Basically, as long as the review has existed as a literary form, writers have sought to make them entertaining for their own sake. Even disregarding that long legacy, the DNA of the angry video game nerd follows in a lineage with Siskel and Ebert at the Movies, Mystery Science Theater 3000, Stomp Tokyo, and SeanBaby.com. Culturally, AVGN was right in line with Penny Arcade. In 2006, Jerry and Mike were entering their 8th year of success with a webcomic whose comedy hinged on acidic vulgarity, casual violence, and an excess of juvenile machismo, a formula that had proven so successful they were able to spin it off into its own expo in 2004. There were many people putting out the same kind of material as James, but his filmmaking background gave him a critical advantage in the early days of YouTube. Simply owning a digital camera and having a basic grasp of audio separated him from his competitors filming on webcams. James Rolfe was perfectly positioned and, by coincidence, struck an iron he didn't even know was hot. Like all YouTubers, he got lucky. He got insanely lucky. While the early YouTube subscriber numbers look modest by modern standards, James Nintendo Nerd was briefly the 8th largest channel on YouTube in 2008 with 125,000 subscribers. And the channel's 3, almost 4 million modern subscribers are respectable but somewhat mundane. the subscriber numbers don't betray just how popular the nerd really was. By the time the AVGN movie was announced in 2011, the channel had nearly 300 million lifetime views. He didn't just have viewers, he had fans, passionate fans who made fan art. Not just fan art, fan video games. It is no overstatement to say that the angry video game nerd was a phenomenon. The book is structured around James's career as a filmmaker, taking it as a given that James is in fact not a YouTuber. Even AVGN is conceptualized as a Cinemassacre production, just one of the many things that James has made. James has been making movies since he was 8 years old, and in the telling of the story, James chronicles his career from that point through film school to the first performance of his band Rex Viper in October 2021. The shocking thing really is how absent the nerd is in the book, to the point it's hard to articulate how little weight is given to the subject. You learn more about what James thinks of the film Wavelength than you do the web show that is, holistically, his 20-year career. Wavelength is a 1967 experimental short film created by Canadian multidisciplinary artist Michael Snow. Wavelength as a film is relatively easy to describe, but difficult to explain. It functions as something of an inkblot test for critics, as the way in which you go about explaining it will inevitably betray something about the way in which you approach film. Some critics praised the film as the birth of a nation or Citizen Kane of underground films, while other critics heckled the film and many walked out. Michael Snow, for his part, found this hilarious. Wavelength, like many avant-garde films, is what you bring to it. Is it a 45-minute long shot of a wall, or is it a film about film and its relationship to time? That is an exercise for the viewer. This versatility has allowed the film to be used as a foundation for complex discussions in film theory, but despite its importance, Wavelength is perhaps better known as a foil for students, the archetype of heady, pretentious films to endure in film school. Students prime themselves to reject the film, but even in rejection, they engage with Wavelength. The only constant in watching Wavelength is the active viewership itself. You must physically experience the film to understand it. If Wavelength could be said to have a core theme, it would be reflection. The film uses boredom and frustration to force the viewer to engage. A wandering mind is, in its own way, an intended response. The viewer is compelled to reflect on their role in proceedings, their role as a viewer. The movie, in essence, holds a mirror up to the audience. In cursing the time lost and in describing their tortuous experiences, even the most checked out students unknowingly engage with the film's ideas. That is the unique power of Wavelength. Even in rejecting it, the viewer learns something about themselves. James's profile as a filmmaker is ultimately dominated by his one feature film, crowdfunded in 2011, shot in 2012, and released in 2014. Summer 2024 will be the 10th anniversary of The Angry Video Game Nerd, the movie, a truly bizarre and intriguing piece of outsider art. All movies are miracles, but this one is a bit more of a miracle than most. By all rights, it should not exist. The production was troubled in all the ways that productions are, and then on top of that, in a number of ways that movies typically aren't. It is, on some, not very good, but that much has been said before. It is, as a story, rudderless and confusing, an unresolved conflict of creative fascinations, external pressures, and foundational bad decisions. It's tempting to get caught in the quagmire of those decisions, but for the most part, it can all be traced back to boring foundational issues. And learning of all the myriad ways in which the budget was poorly optimized, and seeing the dated and weak humor in watching an actor who isn't enamored with the mythology of James Rolfe pronounce the name Deathwathics to little success, it's easy to latch on as though those details are the thing that makes the movie what it is, but the true problem is much more basic.
Honey, don't get your panties in a wad.
I'm not wearing any panties.
The script was written haphazardly by James and his high school buddy Kevin Finn over the course of almost 6 years, originating shortly after AVGN itself in 2006. It is trying to be a supersized episode of the web show and a flex of James's skills as a filmmaker and a self-aware B-movie version of a blockbuster, and just something altogether not the web show. This is the foundational problem, an inability to decide on what the project actually was. Without a creative vision, an actual big picture creative vision of what the finished product is supposed to be, the end product lacks focus, lacks intent, lacks the backstop of feedback that would tell the two of them that Deathwathics, as the name of the film's ultimate kaiju villain, is an in-joke between the writers that just isn't very funny. The entire movie bizarrely revolves around the nerd being compelled in some way to review E.T. for the Atari 2600, the fragmentary shards of the movie as a supersized episode, but clearance for the actual E.T. intellectual property was never secured, requiring the movie to revolve around a spoof instead, which undercuts the verisimilitude of the movie as a big budget episode. The core plot never makes much sense, the motivations of the nerd are incoherent, and the core conflict seems to be that the nerd doesn't want to review the game because it gave him nightmares as a child, which itself appears to be an episode lifted from James' own childhood, as a version of the scene is one of the recurring nightmares James describes in the first chapter of the book. The production itself was plagued with indecision. James was wearing a lot of different hats that placed tremendous demands on his attention, requiring a level of delegation that he was simply unprepared for. The process stretched out years longer than anyone wanted and left James thoroughly burnt out and disillusioned with the whole circus. Some AVGN viewers wonder why the film introduces two new characters, Cooper and Mandy, rather than relying on Mike, Kyle, Bootsy, or any of the other day players that featured in AVGN episodes, and I feel like the answer is obvious. Can you imagine Mike Matai trying to act in a feature film? No, just no. James himself struggles through the movie because, well, he's not an actor. He is an actor in the literal sense. He performs a character on camera professionally, but he is and always has been an actor of convenience. The only reason he is the nerd is because he didn't have anyone else around to play the nerd instead. That's not to say James isn't good at being the nerd. It takes work to be a clown. James has skills as a performer. His ability to suppress his self-consciousness and yell, scream, fart, and vomit for an audience isn't to be downplayed. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get mad on camera? There's a whole instinct of embarrassment, of self-preservation that you need to bury in order to sit alone in a room and howl at full volume for an audience that doesn't even exist. They can't see you, the real you, sitting on the floor of your basement, debasing yourself for them. They're just phantasms off in the future that are going to consume some ghost of you, spewed out at them by their phones as a crass homunculus of photons and digital audio. It's easy to postulate on what the movie maybe should have been instead. a low-budget horror movie or creature feature, literally just a big-budget YouTube video in the same vein as the Channel Awesome anniversary specials, basically anything other than what it actually was. But I have mulled on and dismissed the notion that AVGN the movie is an aberration. While there are undeniable conflicting incentives in the mix, the whole thing was clearly an extension of the angry video game nerd because that was the thing the crowd would respond to, the thing they could raise money for, I still think what we got is ultimately truthful to James's instincts as a filmmaker. James's earliest filmography has been lost to the inevitable rot of VHS tapes, but conveniently the book preserves many of them as anecdotes, lessons, and technological milestones in James's journey as a filmmaker. The book by volume is mostly concerned with, second, the shooting of AVGN the movie, and first, the documentation and preservation of over 24 home movies James produced in the 1990s between the ages of 12 and 18. James, from his own telling, draws a lot of energy from being the director, which in the nebulous hierarchy of the playground is less a creative visionary and more the child who leads the play. These home movies, which James pointedly and explicitly calls films, are, from their descriptions, basically what you'd expect from a child let loose with a camcorder. They're improvisational, loose, unfocused, and shot in linear order. In short, filmmaking as a form of play. Getting friends to act wasn't easy. Everyone was busy. Next time I got some of them over was Snicks, 1993. I quickly thought of a spontaneous story about an ancient warlock, Snicks, who died centuries ago but left behind a mask made of paper and feathers. In the present day, the mask is discovered and possesses my friend with the warlock's spirit when he puts it on. He stalks me and tries to kill me. We made up the plot as we went along, but it was cut short when his mom called him home to dinner. After that, I had to complete his scenes by puppeteering the mask in close-ups only and performing Snicks's voice myself. Again, it was complete garbage, but it survived. It's my oldest existing movie to feature live actors besides myself, and has become sort of, in a strange way, a classic of mine. His actors were whatever neighbors were available. In spite of his pleas, the filming of Dino Men from D4, 1994, rolled over from Saturday into Sunday and had to be abandoned because his friends just didn't want to do a second day. Night of Total Terror, 1996, was the first movie where James felt his friends wanted to be there. It was, in his own words, a blatant rip of Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Maltese Falcon, the MacGuffins of those films replaced with a cursed genie lamp. His films eventually settled into a routine of James hanging out with a few friends making stuff they found fun. James learned to treat the films with soft hands as his friends refused to learn lines, rarely respected continuity, and occasionally would just overwrite the tape and destroy the footage. This informed his style as a director. James says he likes to work in small crews, treating actors as close personal friends and encouraging them to improvise. This informal style, where productions are measured in hours rather than days, and the enjoyment of the actors is given priority, was well suited to the angry video game nerd series. Mike could goof around and make James laugh, and it would translate reasonably well to YouTube. But the AVGN movie exposed the flaws in James's filmmaking approach. Union actors in Los Angeles don't want to be the director's friend, and the shooting schedule of Snicks Returns does not prepare you for 28 days of principal photography for a feature film. The AVGN movie is, spiritually, just another home movie. So, I may have misrepresented the book, though maybe you already figured this out. It's bad, but in the constellation of awful YouTuber autobiographies, which range from shamelessly improvisational to active attempts to obfuscate crime, a movie-making nerd doesn't really rank. It's not that kind of bad, but it is also impressively self-destructive. As I went through its pages, I found myself tempted to make sweeping claims about how James sees the world, how he sees himself, but stopped when I realized that I couldn't tell the difference between statements that implied a total lack of self-reflection, a mind that still held juvenile opinions 20 years after the fact as sincerely as the day they were first formed, and the weak writing. Large swaths of the book are very basic in their construction, pages of paragraphs of 6 to 7 word subject-verb sentences. The most fun class was acting. The instructor was very serious about it. He was like a drill sergeant. The fans take an active role in the movie. They're the ones requesting the nerd to review the game. I think that's a great thing. The fans helped create the idea for this movie. But my character, the nerd, doesn't want to review the game. He feels pressured. Not all of the assignments were fun. Some of them were rudimentary, like painting grayscales and color wheels. All were tedious, messy, and basic. Some of the textbook classes required writing boring essays to explain why time is like a grain of sand. In other words, do your best to come up with some bullshit. Over 430 words are dedicated to a failed location scout for a boiler room set during the filming of AVGN the movie that could be funny if it were well told, could be a trivial event that details a state of mind or just elicits a chuckle, but is delivered with the narrative intensity of a grocery list. I don't doubt that the book is a reasonably accurate accounting of factual events, more or less in the order that they occurred, and that it contains certain insights into James, his life, his way of thinking, and his relationship with himself. But at the same time, I don't think it can really be trusted for much else. It is not a bad thing that it was self-published, but it is a keenly present thing. It is self-serving, as all autobiographies are, but equally self-destructive. The portrait painted by the book is one of a stagnant man with limited capacity to self-reflect, a poor understanding of how and why things happened the way they did, and a general lack of curiosity. A movie-making nerd compels us to conceptualize James not as a revolutionary YouTuber, but as a failed filmmaker. James Rolfe, the main character of the book, reflects back on university 2 decades after the fact and seemingly has no new insights into what his instructors were trying to impart. There are no lessons that were obnoxious in the moment but made sense years later. There is no appreciation for the exposure to cross-disciplinary fundamentals, nothing to suggest that being made to draw household objects with the cold precision of a draftsman gave him an appreciation for the geometry of camera optics. No reflection that being made to write about film as an art, as metaphor, gave him tools that he has called on in his nearly 20-year career as the host of a show deconstructing creative works. He tells a story about a technical exercise in his first year of university, an assignment meant to familiarize students with the basic operation of the 16mm Bolex cameras that were standard film student tools of the day, that he hijacked in order to remake A Night of Total Terror. His own framing of the story makes him look like an egomaniac. The assignment is to simply use the camera successfully to create an image of literally anything. James pitches an elaborate shoot with costumes and lighting. The instructor kindly explains that it's not that kind of assignment. James says he found the assignment annoying at the time, but on reflection, it was really valuable because it taught him to stand up for himself. Because he ignored the instructions, showed up on the day with a box full of Halloween costumes, and hijacked the entire class, and then the instructor just kind of caved because whatever. It's not entirely clear from the book, but the implication is that he spent the entire time as the director. No one else got a turn with the camera, they just got to be his actors. He let me have my way, coaching me through the bulky 16mm technicalities, but letting me shoot my little narrative as intended. Directing a room full of 20 students gave me a positive rush. The energy and excitement was high, and nobody here was goofing around like some of my younger experiences. Here, they were all 100% cooperative. It made me feel like a director. It's a heartwarming story about how if you just ignore the instructions and disregard your peers, you too can get to feel important for an afternoon. He would then remake A Night of Total Terror again in junior year, his third crack at the story by my count, the cursed skull being replaced with a cursed cat statue. Seemingly every movie James makes revolves around an inanimate object that is either cursed or alive or cursed and alive. A conspicuous chunk end with the protagonist being pursued by a demonic doll or action figure. He keeps remaking movies he made when he was a literal child. If not remakes, then sequels. There are 6 Snicks movies. His most recent crack at something not AVGN related was The Head Returns, a 20 years later sequel to a home movie he made in high school. And it ends with James being chased by a haunted doll. Boring anecdotes are interspersed with bizarre claims that seem rooted entirely in an understanding of the world that calcified decades ago. Speaking of high school, James states that in 1997 he got into the kind of music you don't hear as much on the radio, like Metallica. Metallica in 1997 was one of the biggest bands in the world. Every weirdo nerd our age had a Metallica phase in the mid-90s. I had a Metallica phase in the mid-90s. Just to seal the absurdity, he name drops King Nothing, a top 10 single on the US Hot 100 from an album that was #1 in 18 countries in a decade where people still bought albums. If you wanted to communicate the irony of a character in a film, someone with a self-mythology of outsider status while ultimately being no less in step with extremely mainstream tastes, you would drape the character in a Metallica t-shirt. An editor would have caught this immediately. The actual substance of the book is largely a chronological catalog of over 24 of James's home movies, many of which are sequels and outright remakes of his own prior movies. In a roundabout way, this actually seems to have been the original impetus behind writing the book, or at least one of the books that became this book. There's evidence scattered throughout that large chunks of the book are lightly adapted from contemporary documents. Though by evidence, I really mean James basically says it outright on page 150. Now the trauma has long faded, just as the VHS tapes have deteriorated. I never digitized or preserved them since the tapes have had no purpose to me outside of the college circle. This text is the final preservation, which I first wrote down while the incidents were still fresh in my mind. It was the catalyst that made me want to write a book in the first place. Sure, it took decades to finish and publish, but those decades have given me plenty to add. This is weird, right? The admission that this was the catalyst that made me want to write a book in the first place, and that catalyst was still an animating force in 2019, that you're just adding stuff to something you started 2 decades earlier? Is this autobiography legitimately a project he began in 2002, long before the days of his public success, and then just uncritically picked up 16 years later and just started tacking more onto as though the Snicks sextology, getting suspended for an academic year, and launching one of the most influential YouTube channels ever, are all equally weighted events? The trauma he's referring to is an episode that consumes much of the middle of the book. Over 50 pages, about a sixth of the volume, are dedicated to James getting kicked out of university at the end of his first year due to a whole chain of events where he had these roommates who were trashing their dorm and he began taping them documentary style. So they began performing for the camera, escalating their behavior, and then at the end of the year, James took all of the tapes he had of them lighting trash on fire, putting holes in the walls, throwing things out of the windows, and cut it all together into a pseudo-documentary that he then sent copies of to the few other people involved, and one of these copies made its way to the dean, who expelled them. The entire episode isn't completely devoid of accountability. He does at times express some remorse for, well, mostly his inactions, but these statements are seemingly stapled on, with the vast majority of the event talked about as unfair accusations and guilt by association, a thing that was done to him. And he even speculates that the school was deliberately malicious in their timing, as the letters of expulsion didn't arrive until too late in the summer to appeal before registration. He insists throughout that he was just a bystander and doesn't really contend with the fact that if you point a camera at someone and they turn to the camera and go, "Hey, check this out," before jump kicking a light fixture until it explodes, you are a participant. But is all this an expression of a true James or just bad writing? Is self-reflection absent because James doesn't experience it, or is it merely his weakness as a storyteller? Is it the lack of an editor to point out that he's ultimately just talking to himself, to tell him his emotions, however deeply felt, just aren't making it onto the page? The way he talks about unfinished home movies from when he was 12 is just really weird, because he treats them as completed objects that are of the same stuff as everything else. AVGN the Movie, 2014, and Crazy Carnage, 1996, the sequel to Mighty Joe Rampage, 1996, left unfinished when the camera battery died, are not strictly treated as equal, but it's insane that they're being compared at all. I keep coming back to James's camera setup. The longer I stared at it, the more the beast consumed me. Why was it? What's going on? Does he even know? Maybe if I built it myself, if I held it in my hands, I could understand.
Is this the fruit of obsession? Is this where compulsion takes us? Are the damned and the damnable all doomed to wander to Home Depot? Building something kind of the same isn't enough. A half-assed cynical replica isn't enough. If you build it out of malice, you inject it full of all your own prejudices. It ends up bad for reasons you created. It tells you nothing. James's board is planed and square, so my board must be planed, squared, and sanded. Taken seriously, a good faith replica, not just a joke. This thing is very strange to build, physically confounding at times. 2 strips of scrap wood and 4 3-inch carpentry screws hold the fluid head in place by gripping the flange around the base, a thing only possible because of the odd profile of the Davison-Sanford FM18 fluid head. I'll admit that by the time my replica was complete, it felt more secure than I'd assumed from photos, but simultaneously precarious. I didn't think it was at risk of spontaneous self-destruction, but still there's a looming sense that I shouldn't push my luck. My screws had already started to bend during the tightening, so done was pretty much done.
The thing I struggled with from the very beginning, the thing my brain chafed against like cheap khaki, is that the end goal here, a camera head mounted to a board, isn't some far-off concept, isn't some radical use case. It's a thing the thing is already made for, already designed to do. Thousands of commenters saw this build and knew immediately, intuitively, that it wasn't right. But plowing through the comments and the commentary of the assholish variety, seemingly none of them knew why. That the head already has a hole in the bottom for a bolt. You can take the lumber and just drill a hole in it. In the industry, it's called a low hat. Cardellini will sell you one made out of anodized aluminum for almost $600, but those aren't very popular. Everybody knows you can get away with $10 of wood and bolts. It's so simple, so straightforward that I can't stop making them. I keep drilling holes in wood and bolting camera heads to them. The thing that's confounding about it is that this is low-budget filmmaking. Like, that's James's thing, right? Scrappy, low-budget filmmaking, practical effects, all the movie magic that can be worked with styrofoam, hot glue, some plywood, and a drill. So why are his low-budget rigs so bad? I've been watching Angry Video Game Nerd episodes for days now in a tsunami of diarrhea and nostalgia for games I never played as a child. I find myself at times uncertain about what it is that I'm actually watching. Maybe some of the beauty of internet videos is that it demolished a lot of corporate ideas about what genres are and what a show looks and sounds like. We now have so many things that never could have existed in a framework of network television, where someone needed to describe their vision to a 50-year-old man in a suit who hasn't watched TV since he was 12 and convince him to pay for it. AVGN is one of those things. It is, across time, formulaic, but ultimately very loose with its structure and identity, and the longer I think on it, the less I believe that it's even a review show. I'm probably not the first person to notice this, and maybe I'm even late to the party, but it occurs to me now, as I psychologically wade hip deep through buffalo turds, that AVGN is, at its heart, a skit show that uses the premise of video game reviews as little more than a framing device, and as such, there's scant allegiance to the games themselves. But even that's not entirely true, because that would suggest a level of consistency that just doesn't exist. Really, it would seem that the show is both review and skit in whatever ratio James and his co-writers are compelled by at the time of writing, though it's unclear to me to what extent they are aware of that about themselves. The game serves as fodder for jokes and skits, and the videos are rarely a comprehensive overview of the subject because they just kind of work the material until they've got a video worth of stuff. It is what it needs to be in order to exist. The nerd was never a sincere expression of James' obsessions. The nerd was always a character. The critiques are as authentic or performative as is convenient. Superficially, the membrane of performance makes AVGN useless as insight into James, but the hitch is that James just isn't a good enough writer to divest himself fully from the end product, to write organically in the voice and mind of the nerd. The way that James talks about wavelength, both in the book and in the standalone video on the subject as himself, are largely indistinguishable from the way that the nerd would talk about wavelength. Wavelength is long, it's boring, it's grating, it's abrasive, it doesn't make any sense, there's no story, they show you a dead body, but then nothing happens. It's just a picture of some waves on the wall. Is that why it's called wavelength? The length of time it takes to get to some waves? Why would they do this? What were they thinking? I feel a certain amount of kinship with James Rolfe. We're basically the same age. We both went to film school and we both ultimately found ourselves making videos about media for YouTube. We both have an enduring interest in the aesthetics of old media, be it VHS camcorders or vintage video games. And we both feel the pressure of creation, the sense that there's just never enough time to do everything that we want to get done. But James, I've learned, has some peculiarities. Better known as the angry video game nerd, James has this behind-the-scenes video that I can't stop thinking about. AVGN Behind the Scenes and Nerd Room Tour 2021. There's just so much going on with it. There's a light stand suspended from the ceiling with craft wire. It's not all weird though. James has all his studio lights on the same power bar, so he can turn the whole setup on and off at the same time. A kind of obvious yet still clever trick that inspired me to rewire the lights that I have over my workbench. The video ends with James cataloging a litany of reasons why he doesn't have as much time for AVGN as he used to. In addition to this behind-the-scenes video, James has an autobiography, a movie-making nerd, which he self-published in 2022. These glimpses James allows into his private life have become the locus of an entire para-audience of hate watchers, cinemassacre truthers, who have memeified and dissected them to truly bizarre levels of hostility and entitlement that I don't particularly care to fully unwind. It's the usual soup of in-jokes piled on in-jokes piled on in-jokes. Almost as compelling as Rolf himself is this community that swirls around him, seemingly offended by his continuing existence, though they will absolutely take offense to that characterization and insist that they're not hateful, fatphobic misogynists, they're just too edgy for woke soy boys, and it is merely their unwavering commitment to free speech that compels them to allow the hateful, fatphobic misogynists to stick around. You know the song and dance. Thing is, though, that Cinemassacre broadly has provided them with a lot of red meat. Mike Matai, who handled moderation of the studio's social presence for years, is kinda an edgy dickhead himself who would pick fights, go on aimless banning sprees, and other misbehavior. He once posted a photo of a penis, not necessarily his penis, but certainly framed to imply that it was his penis, to his Twitter account to win a literal dick measuring contest with rowdy commenters. In the shame-soaked aftermath, he tried to scrub this event from history and, as the moderator of the Cinemassacre subreddit, went on a banning spree there, which led to the formation of the splinter sub, the Cinemassacre Truth. As production of AVGN the movie dragged on through 2013 and 2014, James contracted with multi-channel network Screenwave to manage more of the channel's backend. Now, okay, in the book, James mentions that he has not, in fact, made his millions, that during the time where AVGN was at its peak cultural relevance, their ability to monetize that success was pretty spotty. Their relationship with YouTube as a platform wasn't the best, and while they were able to be grandfathered into the now long defunct director program and retain their ability to post videos longer than 10 minutes, they weren't in the first or even second or even third wave of channels admitted to the partner program. Merchandising, the publication contract with game trailers, and various one-off contracts provided an income that made AVGN viable as a job, but James claims, and I'm inclined to believe, that this did not manifest as the kind of wealth drawn in by the likes of Smosh, Shane Dawson, and other early YouTube contemporaries. James is justifiably proud of AVGN the movie, a film that by all rights shouldn't exist, that should have fallen apart, that very well could have ruined the channel, ruined his finances for the rest of his life, ruined his marriage, and ruined his friendships. A lot of people helped make the movie, but very few championed it. AVGN the movie, for all its faults, isn't the product of a miracle. It's the product of James Rolfe. And it nearly destroyed him. So I have this theory that in 2014, when the movie did not manifest greener pastures, when James realized that he kinda hated making movies at that scale and was loaded up on credit card debt from finishing the movie, someone at Screenwave said, "We can fix your monetization problems." Because what follows in 2015 through 2022 is just an absolute frenzy of content. podcasts, clip compilations, panel shows, roundtables, vlogs, full season videos, basically every form of content possible that could either be offloaded entirely to an outside editor or would otherwise maximize efficiency. Stuff that takes an hour to record and 40 minutes to edit. Cinemassacre goes from publishing a little over 1 video per week in 2013 to publishing 5 videos a week in 2017. In order to facilitate this, a new cast of hosts appears very suddenly. Screenwave employees who are already on the clock and don't have scheduling conflicts or other jobs that they would need to work around to do a podcast, 2 panel shows a week. People who are convenient. Cinemassacre through Screenwave became visibly extremely corporate extremely quickly. And remember, James doesn't see the channel as the angry video game nerd, he sees it as Cinemassacre, the production house. So while this transition made sense to him, it made less sense to his fans, since all of these secondary videos would show up in their subscriptions, not just AVGN videos. When you see the channel has a podcast where James is only an occasional guest, the narrative of a corporate takeover, of James selling out, writes itself. But, none of this would matter if it were good. If the podcast is entertaining, no one's gonna care that Justin and Kieran and Ryan suddenly show up out of nowhere or that James isn't the main focus. But it's not good, because these dudes they bring in are a void of charisma with basically no on-screen chemistry, because the reason they're there is convenience.
Recently, I took the old website and I made a big document of every single article that was on the old website and what YouTube video or it goes to, or whether that video is lost and we would have to get it from the sources. So I have this huge map and I gave it to Justin and Kieran and all of them, and they're going to start digging through that, or having someone dig through that and start uploading some of the old stuff, like the all the Turtle Tuesdays and all of that stuff.
The goal,
Forgot about those.
because we're using all the WordPress stuff and stuff. The goal is to get Monster Madness on there fully and finalized.
Also, James just isn't very good at spontaneous conversation. He's not a strong podcast host, but he's the star of the show. He's the person people are tuning in for, which makes a chatty podcast format a really bad choice. It's a product showing the star of the show in the worst light possible. Then there's James' dad rock band Rex Viper, named after a joke character from the Big Rigs Over the Road Racing episode of AVGN. Rex Viper is so insubstantial a project that it would barely merit mentioning it if it weren't for the fact that James, and James alone, seems to take it really seriously and talks about it like it's important. The sum total of Rex Viper is 2 live performances and 4 music videos for parody songs that are just songs from 80s movies with the lyrics sometimes retooled to throw in video game references or the instrumentation altered to mix in game themes. Eye of the Tiger Electronics, Mighty Wings and Hadoukens, Nintendo Power of Love. I'm gonna be honest, I hate this entire genre. I am the last person to give it a fair shake, so I'm just gonna move on. All of this is easy pickings for truthers. Whether it be the cringe or the cynicism, there's a lot here to make fun of. Truthers even have a name for all of it, the slob wave era. Get it? Because Justin Silverman is fat and Kieran Fallon has that heavy metal look going on. Ultimately though, no matter what the Cinemassacre truth might be accurate about, it's all just a vehicle for ableism, fat phobia, sexism, transphobia, and they're Chan trolls. It's not that deep. They are, in fact, just haters. They have a particular hate boner for James's wife, April, for reasons that are complicated but not complex. They'll frame it that James was dragged kicking and screaming from his basement because she wanted kids. They cast James as a henpecked husband whose career was derailed by a woman. This flies in the face of both everything James has ever said and also just observable reality. James and April were together before the first AVGN episode hit YouTube. There is no Garden of Eden for Eve to tarnish. April has been here the whole time. During the filming of AVGN the movie, she moved with James to LA for 6 months and took on the role of production manager. If the movie had one champion, it was James. If it had a second, it was April. But because he describes her as giving him an ultimatum about having kids, they are able to depict it as browbeating, vilifying April as a nagging shrew who uses their children as a chain to keep James from realizing his ambitions, as though it is preposterous on its face that James might honestly prefer fatherhood to making videos for the internet. One time, James and Mike sat down to record a Let's Play, and James had somewhere he needed to be, to pick up his kids from swim lessons or something, which gave him a hard out of 5:40 if he was going to get there on time. 5:40 came and went. James started to visibly panic when he noticed the time and wound up leaving rather ungracefully before finishing the LP later in the evening alone.
Let's break it.
All right. Well, anyway, that's it. We just ran out of time because I have to be done at 5:40 right now. And
so what's going to happen
exactly
is
5:40.
Next time you see this, James is going to beat this on his own.
I'll try
without me because the way we record. So
yeah. Okay, just to make it clear again, what happened was that we ran out of time.
Truthers have clung to 5:40 as a meme ever since. These are what James describes as comments of an asshole-ish variety. And really, the thing with the 2021 behind the scenes video, the odd texture of the whole thing, isn't that it's partially a response to these comments, but that all of it is. That's the animating force behind it. That's the reason why it exists. It's not a behind the scenes room tour for the sake of easy content, it's an explanation, a defense. As a room tour, it's bad. James bounces from odd detail to odd detail, spends tremendous amounts of time outlining problems, and the whole of it is weird and a nearly incomprehensible level of honesty about his bespoke inefficiencies, but all because it's a defense of Screenwave, a defense of his wife, a defense of his children, and a defense of his priorities in life.
So Screenwave hooked me up. So Screenwave set me up with a whole new server. Screenwave also helped me with my internet. Screenwave and I have been working to resolve it. And then I sent a rough edit to Screenwave and they just did the rest of the post-production and effects.
So why doesn't James have enough time anymore? What's he spending his time doing if not making AVGN? I don't know, and I honestly don't particularly care. If AVGN has declined in some spiritual way, it's not because James isn't grinding away with burnout-inducing 16-hour days. In watching through all 52 hours of nerd videos in reverse chronological order, I'm not even convinced that there is some calculable decline. Maybe this is to its detriment, but the show has always been spotty and kind of ragged at the edges, and it has remained incredibly consistent in that zone. Maybe the format is just dated. YouTube has left AVGN behind. Maybe the audience is just aging out. Maybe James does lack ambition, or he's just out of ideas. Hell, maybe it is his wife and kids getting in the way of the show, but here's my hot take on that. That's fine. The angry video game nerd is not a load-bearing pillar of reality, it's a YouTube sketch comedy. It doesn't need to exist. I do not know James Rolfe, but in this I'm confident. James Rolfe loves his wife and kids, and they are his top priority. The best written parts of his autobiography by a substantial margin are the stories about the challenging births of his two daughters and how he discovered that he really enjoys being a father. His mistake was to share that fact with an audience too immature to comprehend it. No, not just too immature, an audience patently unwilling to comprehend it. Probably the most baffling mistake James has made is assume that his haters are here to be persuaded.
Do they want me to suffer?
Yeah, James, they kinda do. But still, mistakes have been made. What's the point of having a company to handle all this stuff if James is going to make a video where he tries to do his own PR response to his haters by showing off his janky DIY rigging? Why employ editors if they're going to leave in the footage where he has a humiliating panic attack?
Well, anyway,
part of what is so transfixing in all of this is this parade of contradictions, that from the outside there are these very visible, very public decisions being made, but those decisions aren't producing the intended results. Even without access to their actual back end, I can say that massively increasing the channel output absolutely improved revenue. Even if the podcasts and whatnot underperformed, there's just so many of them. It is on net hundreds of millions of views. But what good is that if it damages the brand? What's the point of doing damage control at all if it just raises a million more questions? In a spiritual sense, James has trapped himself on the couch. His access to the capital resources needed for larger projects is dwindling, and his sensibilities as a filmmaker are too myopic to appeal to an audience that isn't humoring him, telling him that Rex Viper is cute and they're just glad he's having fun. In a more literal sense, James has trapped himself on the couch because the room is just too small. I had heard this before, but I find that just saying it or looking at frame grabs doesn't do justice to the realities of physical space. So I did the thing any normal person would do and built a 1/12 scale diorama of the nerd room. He needs to haphazardly hang things from the ceiling and build Franken low hats because when he moved house in 2016, he had Kyle build a replica of the nerd basement in the new garage so that the new basement could be dedicated to a fake video rental store. But Kyle, whose day job is renovating houses, built the room as an actual room, not as a set with accommodation for the needs of recording, and for reasons I can only speculate on, the set is only 8 feet wide. I don't know, maybe the rest of the garage is a workshop, or they still needed to fit a car in there. I really, truly don't know, but it would feel cramped just as a rec room. But as a film set, it is claustrophobic. There's nowhere for stands to go. And okay, now every film set is crowded with junk. Every film set is a jungle of stands and tripods and Apple boxes and lens boxes and lights on standby. But this tightens things down to a point where you just can't get in and out without stepping over everything. It becomes a game of parkour just to change a battery. And when you're working mostly alone, that gets frustrating really fast. And when you're frustrated, you get impulsive. And those impulses lead to half-measure solutions. And those half-measure solutions accumulate into a whole network of bespoke inefficiencies that you just live with because the process of unraveling them feels just so big. It was in the finishing touches of James's low hat that it began to make sense. Screwing on a bubble level did something to it, transformed it. It was still janky, it was still inexplicable, but I suddenly cared for it. No longer saw it as just a heap of scraps stapled together for a bit. It's still a bad solution, it still looks visibly like a bad solution, but it felt personal. I could imagine myself as James, self-conceptualizing as not an indie filmmaker, but as a backyard filmmaker, a kid with no resources but what he can scrounge out of the garage, and this felt far more homogeneous with that than with any other James I had considered so far. In 2010, James posted an autobiographical documentary called The Dragon in My Dreams. James tells a story of a recurring nightmare he had as a child, being borne down on by this massive dragon, an image that he connects to a dragon-shaped water feature in a neighborhood park his parents took him to as a toddler. For the video, James, with friend Matt behind the camera, visits the park on the day it just so happens that workers are removing the dragon from the spot where it sat for 30 some odd years. In voiceover, he reflects on his childhood, on the imagery of the dragon, on the then upcoming milestone of turning 30, and holding back tears, he takes a knee beneath the dragon and avows himself to the path of the filmmaker, while the dude who was working the jackhammer stands just off screen having a smoke while these two guys do their thing. It's all kind of cringe, a truly elemental example of pretentious, self-important film school pap, but whatever. Let he who is without cringe throw the first stone. The conclusion of the video is muddled, just kind of wanders between a few different ideas, but the intent is clear. It's a reflection on just how far James has come and an aspiration of just how far he has to go. A phase of his life coming to an end just as conclusively as this dragon being torn out and replaced. That metaphor crumbles to bitter ash when you realize that the dragon didn't really go anywhere. It was displaced all of 30 feet, from sitting inside the water fountain to standing beside the gate of Fox Chase Playground. In a way, the dragon in my dreams is itself a brutal metaphor for James's career. James is a calcified dragon whose films have barely changed between high school and middle age, uprooted from VHS and transplanted 30 feet away in HD. I think about James every day now, every time I have to step over something that's in a bad position, every time I need to get something off a shelf but there's stands or tripods or boxes in the way. Every stack of books, every lens without a home, every camera bag left on the couch for weeks on end, every clamp, every cable, every stray roll of tape has become an accusing presence in my life, a bespoke inefficiency that I can stare directly at and yet never fully escape. What if the problem is me? James hasn't moved, I've moved. AVGN is what it's always been. The truthers claiming that the show is bad now are getting spooked by their own shadows. The show is what it's always been. It isn't bad now but good in the past. You're just getting older. You're not seeing a titan of YouTube fallen from grace. You're seeing a man as immovable in his interests and habits as Atlas. But so what? Would it even matter either way? We don't have the James Rolfe, we have a crass homunculus of James, constructed out of photons and wavelengths, delivered to us through our screens, a codex of symbols we can interpret but never fully understand, and in that void between the real and the perceived, impose meaning compelled by what we'll never know. Today we're going back. We're going flashback. Released in 1991, this game was available for most consoles available at the time, plus PC, but all I've got is the Super Nintendo version, so that's what we're playing. This was part of a trend of so-called cinematic platformers. Many of these games are considered classics because of the way they elevated games as an art form, took it seriously, and confronted audiences with complex, sober stories. They weren't just reflex-based arcade games where you hop on Goombas to rescue a princess, they told complex stories like films. So will flashback to lighten us down, or will it put the ass back in classic? Let's find out. It opens with a pretty impressive 3D cutscene that was clearly intended for PC because the Super Nintendo is really struggling. Still, many Super ports at the time would have replaced these with a static slideshow, so the fact they even tried to keep it is impressive. Okay, so your character crash lands in the jungle with no guidance on who you are or what you're doing here. Well, turns out that's intended. Your character has amnesia and needs to figure out why he crash landed in the jungle. The only thing you know is your name is Conrad. The first thing you notice is that the animations are very smooth and lifelike, because like Prince of Persia, the developers rotoscoped actual footage of actors walking and jumping. This does lend the game a certain weight. When you drop down off a ledge with your pistol drawn and ice tube mutants, it feels super badass. Yeah, take that, you mutant fucks. The second thing you notice is that the controls are ass. Every time you push a button on the controller, Connor takes one giant step forward, or jumps, or rolls, or draws his gun, and you need to wait for the whole animation to finish before you can do anything else. And that'd be fine, but the game still has tons of reflex-based obstacles that require very precise timing. One of the very first challenges you're given is jumping over this pit, but to do it you need to start running on the previous screen and then enter the command to jump before the new screen has even finished loading, or you just run off the edge into the pit below and then need to climb back out, waiting a short eternity for Connor to go through his lifelike cinematic animation every time. Just like in cinema, Conrad doesn't have a life meter on screen. Instead, he has a personal shield that can absorb a certain number of shots. Okay, so that's health by a different name. So to check your health, you need to open your inventory and cycle through everything you're carrying until you get to your shield module, where it'll tell you how many charges you have left. Oh yeah, that's cinematic. Cinematic is dog farts. Yeah, it turns out that in video games, cinematic is a code word for shit. Oh, the controls suck ass? Just tell players it's cinematic. The story gives you no clues about where to go or what to do. It's cinema. You eventually get to a giant pit that this shady fuck tells you to jump into in order to get to New Washington. At least he warns you that you'll die if you jump without an anti-gravity belt, which he offers to sell you for 600 credits. Okay, so you need to go find some credits. Fortunately, there's lots of them hidden around different areas of the jungle. But here's the thing, if you go out of your way to get all of them, thinking they'll be useful later, you're wrong. He doesn't just take 600 credits, he takes all your credits. He robs you! Cinematic! Anyway, after you pay this lying fuck everything you have, Connor jumps into the pit and enters level 2. There's nowhere to go. There's just 3 screens. There's nothing but an elevator down into a hole. Sure, you can recharge your shields down there in the hole, but it's not going to get you anywhere. It's cinema. You can jump up to this ledge, but it doesn't go anywhere either. There's this ledge you can see, but it's out of reach. You just can't jump high enough to reach it and pull yourself out. This is your life now. You're trapped here on these 3 screens until you quit. Anyway, what you need to do to progress is confront your insecurities and accept that you're not a filmmaker either. What did you say?